go. Let's go live. All right. Welcome to Quiet Horror 5. Well, I'm not sure if we are live or not. Logan, are we live? Yeah, there we go. We're live. I'm sorry. Thanks for putting up with me, folks. Anyway, thanks to all of you who think we've done such a good job tonight that you've already clicked the like button 6 times as of this very moment. Appreciate you guys. No, I know why you guys do that, and I appreciate it. And yep, I see on the sidebar chat that we're live. Thanks, guys. Hey, Kenneth, Michael, everybody else who's watching. All right, so been a couple months since we've done this due to various reasons. So I've been looking forward to it. So how are you guys? Jeff, how you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm doing pretty well.
And Scott, this is your Friday night, isn't it?
It is.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you have Wednesdays and Thursdays off.
And Sundays too.
Oh.
But I suffer the other days, so I earn it.
Suffer the other days. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go, I think, in this order. Scott, you're going to read first because I think the reason is you want your stepdaughter to hear you before she has to go to bed. Is that right?
Yeah. She has school tomorrow, so yeah.
All right, and then I'll go in the middle of the Thomas brothers, and then Jeff can finish it up. How's that sound?
Cool.
Thank you to.
Hi, Bridget, by the way.
What's that?
I said hi to Bridget, my niece Bridget.
Oh, nice. Okay, so Scott, what are you going to read?
I'm going to read Wrought Iron Skeleton from Midnight in New England from Down East Books.
I know that book. So yeah, for anyone listening for the first time, these guys are both stellar writers. In the show notes on YouTube, I do link to them on Amazon. So buy their books. If you should read both of them. If you got kind of a Halloween autumn bent, then you're gonna really love Scott's work. And if you got more of a sci-fi horror bent, you're gonna really love Jeff's work. And maybe you love both. So I read Punktown several years before I met Jeff Thomas, and I was like, holy hell, who thinks of this stuff? This is great. So, all right. So you're reading from Midnight in New England, and the story title again is
Wrought Iron Skeleton.
Okay. I will mute and you go ahead. The last thing I want to say is thanks to the Patreons. Now this is not a Patreon post. This is available for everybody, but thanks to the patrons for keeping me going, and I really appreciate it. So, all right. Thanks, Scott.
Okay. Am I going in, Mike?
You are going in.
All righty.
Yeah.
It is Wrought Iron Skeleton. Massachusetts, 1877. Mrs. Trowbridge painted the bones of animal skeletons once the flesh was boiled away. Then in autumn, when the leaves got their color, she hung them in the surrounding woods as if the maples, birches, and sumacs weren't enough. Never one for wire, she fastened the bones together with string or yarn where necessary. But over time, these materials weathered and the bright dangling skeletons transformed. Some of their parts might be missing, or sections might appear unnaturally elongated due to the stretching of damp yarn. In these cases, the bones became the remains of creatures not yet fumbled upon by evolution, or perhaps the echo of things that strolled the globe before man took up quill to record them. I have forever possessed an interest in antiquated objects, and while Mrs. Trowbridge was something of a relic in her own right. It was not her bones that I sought that morning when I volunteered to help those who gathered to seek for her earthly shell. In all honesty, I was looking for things. Considering her age, 90-something, if memory serves, I thought I might come upon some hoary treasures in the sooty heap that had been her old salt docks. The smoke seemed to have settled in the trees, lending a touch of sepia to the autumnal mist common to October mornings. Small skeletons rattled in the low branches when we brushed past them, and things that I hoped were only birch twigs snapped underfoot. I have never been accused of philanthropy, which is not to say that I'm as unscrupulous as the salvagers who would lure a ship to rocky reefs in order to reap a soggy reward. Still, I was not one to slight opportunity. Once or twice, 7 times, I had set upon nocturnal forays into the homes of antediluvian locals who, busy making amends with their creator, seemed not to mind my rummaging about their dark rooms for collectibles. I kept an ear open for word of funerals, scheduling my adventures accordingly. Sometimes it was a race against the departed's ravenous offspring, but most of the time the houses sat empty and I was at my leisure to go about my hunting. One time, however, I misheard a bit of dialogue and consequently stole into a place where an old woman was apparently near death and not actually in its possession. The word of Spinster Spooner's funeral, in the fragment of conversation that I had perceived, turned out to be a prediction, not an arrangement. There I was in the middle of the night in a great rambling tomb of a house when suddenly the ghastly figure of the hag shot up in her bed. I started, of course, but called swiftly upon my resourceful nature. I noted that she had a carving of that poor thorn-crowned fellow hanging over her bed. I promptly and very earnestly mentioned to her that I was Saint So-and-so come to see her off. Well, with that, she gave a blissful little smile, then settled back and went about her death rattle. I came away with a few handsome items that night, but I've digressed. At any rate, that clammy morning, I had joined the rest trudging through damp leaves to the burned wreckage of the Trowbridge house. I received my share of suspicious glances from the boys of the fire brigade because, as mentioned, I was not known for my generosity and thus my motives were likely to be questioned. At least they had the restraint not to accuse me outright of anything unsavory. The house had been a fine specimen of 18th century construction, but now it was one of God's smashed toys, a few upright fragments of rooms seemingly resting atop a Baroque nest of blackened timber. A shame, really, for the house and the occupant. The fire seemed to have started on an upper level, according to witnesses of the previous night. An attempt had been made to rescue the widow, and one fellow swore he saw a figure stumbling about behind the flames, but the fire drove them out from the first floor. The body was not recovered, thus our morning stroll in the burnt-smelling mist. Looking at the ruin, I harbored little hope of finding anything worth taking, and even if there were treasures, they would need to be of concealable size. I hoped I would not be the one to actually discover the scorched corpus, and as it turns out, I was not. Dear heavens, Mr. Needham, one of the more ethical volunteers exclaimed. He stepped back from the blackened mess where he had been prodding with his stick. I expected her to be burnt, he said, but there's not a trace of flesh upon her. While moments before I had dreaded the thought of such a discovery, I suddenly found myself as morbidly inclined as any young fellow and hastened to view the horror. Tangled among the dark wreckage, partly obscured by ash and mud and morning shadows, lay an adult-sized assemblage of blackened bones, which despite the gray day and the debris, had something of a gleam to it. I puzzled and tapped the ribs with my cane. The sound was distinctly metallic. I don't believe that's her, I noted. The others gathered, and the undertaker, Bellows, put his hands on the thing, determining that it certainly was not what was left of Mrs. Trowbridge. He tapped his knuckles on the forehead of the grinning skull. Wrought iron, he noted. We all looked to Simon Perry, the blacksmith, as if he might have an explanation. Don't look to me, he said. Curious. I was intrigued. Whatever is it? Needham, the volunteer, asked. Even though the bones were formed of metal and not Adam's rib, it seemed as if the undertaker was burdened with a task of authority. The blacksmith stood stupefied alongside the rest of us. Well, it appears to be a replica of sorts. She always did like bones. Queer old woman, Simon Perry muttered. I noticed something just then. Look there, how she must have positioned that bucket in its hands as if it were fetching water. There was still a trace of ash-colored liquid in the vessel. Before long, Mrs. Trowbridge was uncovered. While she was not cooked down to the bone, she was quite charred, and the smell was something I'd rather forget. She was gently lifted from the devastation and wrapped in a sheet before being slid onto the back of a wagon. The party of volunteers and brigade men slowly broke up. I went to have another look at the metal skeleton lying half buried under boards and falling leaves. It was darker than the seared wood, the hollow eyes so vacant. It chilled me to think that we living beings harbor anything like that ghastly visage beneath our soft, pretty flesh. Still, there was a beauty to it, conjoined with my horror. As it turns out, I was the last to leave. I had found no trinkets worth pocketing, nor for whatever reason did I seem to care. I headed off along the path away from the house into the woods where brick-colored bird bones floated under dissipating maples and the smeary blue skeleton of a raccoon swayed, clattering in the breeze that came up to shoo off the mist. I had come into possession of a large Center Hall house dating from 1774, complete with wide king's timber pine floors and great twin chimneys. The fireplaces were set flush in the baronial paneled walls, and the exterior corners boasted wooden quoins. It was a wonder of symmetry and grace. It was at this house one fine October evening that I entertained a small party of close friends. Idle chatter was an art that I had long mastered, as good a diversion as drink or flirtation, though I may have liked it best when the three were combined. That night I was in top form. A chill warranted the crackling pile of birch, and the brandy that followed dinner offered heat of its own. My dear friend Richard had brought along his latest fiancée, the giggly Madeline. She burst into unscrupulous laughter at one of my more imprudent jokes and dashed theatrically out of the parlor, her skirt, the size of a circus tent, hissing past the hearth. A sudden scream, shrilled, and a very pale version of Madeline came rushing out of my adjacent study, a hand to her considerable bosom. Maddie, I said innocently, what is that thing? She demanded. I chuckled. All eyes had turned from Madeline's bosom to me. The skeleton? Yes, a marvel, isn't it? The others rose from their seats and went to investigate. There, standing like a starved, blackened suit of armor in a corner of my study, was the wrought iron mystery I had salvaged from the Trowbridge ruins. And how much did you pay for that? Richard asked. Richard's nerves were wrought iron, so he was not as appalled as the others. I found it very lifelike, or should I say deathlike, isn't it? Madeline peeked back in over Richard's shoulder and asked in an accusatory tone, why would you want a thing like that? It's unique for one. It's also a marvel of craftsmanship. My physician tells me that it's correct in every detail. Richard was warming to the thing. It is an interesting piece, I suppose, but a bit on the morbid side. Perhaps that's the appeal. I gave them a devilish smile. All collectors are guilty of a measure of madness, and my friends knew this and loved me for it. More brandy. Imagine my horror when I woke the next morning to find my front door lying in the frost and my wrought iron skeleton gone from the house. Not even Richard would have taken a joke so far. It was a malicious act, really, and if it was meant to be humorous, it certainly missed its mark. I promptly dismissed my few disgruntled servants, despite their proclamations of innocence, and set out to find the heavy black anomaly. It was obviously the work of more than one culprit, for no single man, even a powerful man, could have moved that thing the 1.5 mile distance I traversed to find it. Apparently, they had dragged the skeleton, for there was a broken trail leading the way, the frosty leaves displaced, the damp grass gouged by the hard black foot bones. Oh, clever, I said, leaning on my stick, having followed the trail to the cheerless black heap that had been Mrs. Trowbridge's house. Reddish leaves sprinkled down and skittered over the tragic clutter. It was the most elaborate prank I'd ever witnessed, and if it had been someone on the other than myself on the receiving end, I'd have admired the effort. They had taken the skeleton and positioned it face down amongst the charred boards, going so far as to dig a hole to accommodate the bulk of the iron torso, suggesting that the thing had been burrowing. I hired some men to return the sculpture to my house and hired others to return my door to its hinges and add a number of secure locks. I was furious, the more so for my confusion. Perhaps, I speculated, it was the wretched townfolk behind the violation. They all harbored a certain bitterness toward me, after all. It was envy, no doubt, because of my position, because my fortune came from an inheritance rather than my sweat. To hell with them all, I thought. A long night of brooding and brandy followed as I prowled the old house with my pistol in hand, my curses hissing off into unlit corners. I sat and stared at the impassive face of the skeleton, its surface both smooth and rigid, and I wondered with a quiet sense of awe about the construction of such an armature, both the fine piece of jointed metalwork and the bone original it was modeled after. Whether one dubbed it God or evolution, some form of genius had been at work. Still, even more impressive than that, more a mystery than bone and muscle and tendons and organs, was the force of life and the sentience that occupied and animated the corporeal human vehicle. Those were my thoughts before I dozed at the desk, before the aroma of coffee seeped into my dreams and summoned my consciousness into the cool bronze of October's morning light. There were birds in the garden, but not the hungry territorial birds of spring. There was a purposeful urgency now in their cries as they plodded their travels south. The coffee was stronger than I like, and some had spilled on the desk near to where my own sleeping skull had weighed. It took me a moment and a sip of the brew to remember that I had dismissed all the servants, and I had no recollection of preparing the stuff. I held the cup away and eyed it quizzically, but then my eyes fell upon the corner where the skeleton should have stood. The wrought iron skeleton gleamed. It stood outside in light and spitting leaves, solemn and black, rigid on the granite stoop. The head turned to face me, the teeth clenched as it regarded me with its inscrutable, scooped out stare. I must have mirrored its rigidity just then as a shock of horror shot through every limb. But a moment later, I was like a rag fluttering backward into the hallway. I slammed the door shut and fumbled the locks, a whole herd of hearts in my chest. It was another trick, of course, a puppet or something like those clever mechanized dolls that jerk their heads and wag their arms in the windows of Boston toy shops. I heard the thump of a footfall and rushed to the parlor, where I pulled aside the drapes and peered out. The skeleton took an awkward step, then another. I gasped. It was walking. Despite the lumbering aspect of its motions, the skeleton conveyed something that I could only term as determination as it started out along the road, rasping through the fallen leaves. I rushed to throw a coat over my sleeping gown and hastened into my boots, a fever of exclamations firing from my lips. As a last-minute thought, I grabbed my pistol from the study and headed out to follow the skeleton. It had not progressed far when I caught up with it. I hung back naturally, shivering, trying not to make noise despite the broken pavement of leaves. How stark it looked against a background of autumnal colors as it jerked along, the head turning ever so slightly from side to side as if looking for something. We ended up at the sad disarray of the Trowbridge house. The iron figure stood with its hands on its cold hammered hips, surveying the scene. I suppose I could go on for pages about my feelings on that cold golden morning, but I'll spare you the bulk of it and only say that a thousand thoughts were in my brain. There was awe and terror, fascination and dread, all of these things colliding, and then in a predominant flush, sadness. The thing of iron bones waded into the wreckage and began sifting through the sooty boards. Its body creaked and the boards clattered, tossed aside. It stooped and stared and went on in its relentless manner for some time before standing and turning to face me. While incapable of expression, there was a questioning quality to the action. What does one say to a metal skeleton? Mrs. Trowbridge, is that you? The neck squealed as the head shook back and forth. It seemed the obvious explanation at that time that this strange sculpture was somehow a vessel for the disembodied spirit of the old woman who had died in the blaze. No, I muttered, not Mrs. Trowbridge. Would you then be the spirit of Mrs. Trowbridge's deceased husband? No, again. Then who are you? Again, the head wagged. Don't you know? I shuddered as the thing took a step toward me. Brittle bits of blackened wood snapped beneath its weight, and leaves hissed and kicked up as it walked within feet of me. Staring in response to my inquiry, it shrugged its metal joints, squeaking. I suppose none of us truly knows what elusive spark holds up our frail figures, be it a spirit or a soul or some other force as yet unimagined by our limited minds. All we even know of ourselves are our personalities. This creature, as it turns out, would prove similar in that aspect. I would never learn who or what occupied that black assemblage of parts, but a form of madness had overtaken me, for I found myself urging the thing to follow me back to the house. It stood hovering in the parlor until I told it to sit. The chair did not care for the idea, groaning beneath the weight of my guest. Dusk softened the windows and a chill came on as I knelt at the hearth and started a fire. The skeleton watched, leaning forward, seemingly in great interest. I could only imagine what my friends would have thought had they come around that evening. There I sat, talking to so many pounds of upright black iron as if it were alive. Sadly, there was no way for the thing to properly communicate, although I did test it some. Do you know where your head is? A thin black arm and in the hand pointed to its skull. Where are your feet? It pointed again. Did you bring me coffee this morning? It nodded. I was thrilled, fascinated. So you prepared the coffee by yourself? The skeleton nodded. I thought for a moment and hesitantly asked, should I fear you? It shook its head. No. I smiled. Well then, seeing as we seem to be on friendly terms, I'll just have to teach you how to write so that our interchanges won't be so one-sided. Would you like to learn to write? The skeleton nodded enthusiastically, the neck squealing. In the morning there was coffee. It seems the skeleton had managed the stairs, for the brew was on the table by my bed when I awoke. Once again, the skeleton had gone out into the morning, back to the ruin. I found it rummaging about the boards, a strangely graceful creature in that it was thin and slow. I wish I knew what it was looking for, but I'd wondered if perhaps it missed its old friend. Good morning, I said. It looked up and nodded and then turned back to its task. Thank you for the coffee. I received a small bow. Then it was back to its business. After thinking a moment, I inquired, excuse me, are you looking for Mrs. Trowbridge? The skeleton shot up and I started stepping back. The thing nodded eagerly. Mrs. Trowbridge is dead, I said. It stared at me. There was no perceivable reaction. Do you understand dead? The skeleton shook its head. I sighed. Come with me back to the house. It's time for your lessons. My companion followed me along the road, past the lake. The trees had made a great ring of color around it, and the sun was trying to penetrate the dark waters. Considering the fact that I was never inclined toward rearing children, I exhibited a great deal of patience when it came to my schooling of the pupil. The skeleton caught on quickly. In no time, it was writing the alphabet, although it had an awkward time holding the quill initially. I taught the student my name and asked it if it too had a title, if the old woman had called it something. It nodded and wrote the letter J. The lessons became a daily routine, as with the visits to the Trowbridge wreckage, where the skeleton continued to scrounge. Within weeks, the skeleton was writing words and added some letters to its name. John. She called you John. The skeleton nodded. Well then, how nice to meet you, John. I held out my hand and my friend took it in its icy black fingers and shook it gently. We found a dead half-grown fox by the road the next morning. It was peaceful looking and bore no sign of injury. John knelt by it creaking and prodded the silvery mass. It's dead, John, the poor little creature, dead. Leaves made soft clicks as they fell in the near wood. John, it's like the bones that Mrs. Trowbridge hung in the trees. Whatever property was within them to make them alive has ceased or perhaps moved on. John looked at me with his hollow eyes and then pointed off toward his old home. Yes, I said, dead like Mrs. Trowbridge. The skeleton returned its gaze to the fox. I'll show you what we do with the dead, John. Come, we'll bring it back to the house and give it a burial. Much like a child who imitates the actions of a parent, John had taken up to reproducing mine. He took a turn digging the hole and helped pad the earth down over the small grave. Some people pray about this time, I explained, but I think that concept might be a bit complicated at this point. While John could offer little to nothing in regards to his origin and history, he was getting to the point where he could formulate crude sentences. One evening, when the month was drawing to its end and the trees were mostly bare against the wide moon-tinted sky, we sat about my desk in the study. His face gleamed strangely in the candlelight. He wrote, she was cold. I made fire. Bad, bad, burn. I began to understand. I nodded. Mrs. Trowbridge was cold, so you tried to make a fire to get her warm, but the house went up? Now John nodded. I remembered back when we found him in the rubble, holding the bucket, and how there was a trace of water left in it. You tried to put out the fire. A nod. Then he wrote, sorry, sorry, sorry. I gathered myself. Well, John, you meant well, and you did the right thing. You tried. You did the good thing, John. You tried to save her. Where Mrs. John wrote. I put a hand on his cold shoulder. She's buried in the ground like the fox. You remember the fox? He nodded, and then he pushed his chair back, and he seemed to gaze off into the fireplace where flames were licking up through the maple logs, and the smoke made ghosts. A touch of snow had fallen in the night, no more than a dusting, but it gave the world an ethereal quality as it softened the road and lightened the shadows under the leafless trees. There was coffee waiting when I awoke and a piece of paper by that. I sat in my bed, tasted the coffee, and took up the note. It was crudely written, a single sentiment emerging from the sepia of coffee stains. Goodbye. I dressed in a rush and started for the Trowbridge house. John's steps were in the snow, odd patterns left by the metal bones. I followed the tracks, but they did not lead to the Trowbridge ruins. They led to the great black circle of the lake. The tracks led into the lake. I caught my breath and stood there looking out at the water, its dark stillness, the empty trees ringed gray around it. I muttered a name, a metal skeleton's name of all things, and I had to laugh at that. I gave a small laugh so that I would not cry. I've kept the lessons that John wrote in the final coffee-stained message. I take them from my desk and ponder them on occasion. Once in a while, and mostly in October, I walk out to the lonely boards that were the Trowbridge house. Weeds have claimed the place, resilient, unthinking entities that they are. Generally, I stop at the edge of the lake on my way back to the house. It's a quiet spot, and the colored leaves spin down to the water and settle on the surface. I imagine John somewhere out in that deep water, lying at the bottom, rusting to the color of autumn leaves.
Great reading, Scott.
Thank you, sir.
That is
So-
a wonderful, remarkable story.
Thanks.
It's so uncanny, but it's heartbreaking. It starts out so eerie, and then it becomes so moving and poetic.
Thanks.
So for those who came in late, and a reminder, the name of that story and the book, the collection that it's in.
It's Wrought Iron Skeleton from my collection, Midnight in New England, from Down East Books, publisher in Maine.
Midnight in New England, such a great title. What span of years does that cover?
Midnight
The stories in that book.
So Midnight in New England takes my first book from 2001, Cobwebs and Whispers. There were only 250 copies made. And so there were stories in it that were, all the stories are set in the past, some in England, some in New England. So Down East Books only publishes things relating to New England. So what I did to give some more exposure to some of the stories from Cobwebs and Whispers is I took some of them as reprints in here, but I wrote a bunch of material for this as well. And I believe I wrote the bulk of them when I lived in Templeton, Mass, where I lived when I wrote The Sea of Ash. So that would have been, I lived there from September of 2002 to November of 2003. So it was within that time frame that I wrote the new material for Midnight in New England, which was added with, again, some reprints from my first book.
What, how did you did you propose this book to Down East Books? Did you send them a proposal or something?
I did. I sent it to them, and I waited and waited to hear from them. I was living in Cherryfield, Maine at the time, in the 1845 Cape, and there was an attached barn attached to the house, and where I would chop wood for our we had a wooden cook stove there and a fireplace. And I'm waiting to hear from them. And one day I'm going into the house where the barn door opens into the library, and there's an envelope that had kind of fallen down and was kind of partly hidden in the cut logs stacked there. And I opened it up, and it was like a letter from Down East Books saying that they were interested in publishing this. But I had proposed it to them, and sent them all the stories.
That's so cool.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And
Thank you.
all right, so I appreciate those who watch live. Of course, the vast majority watch in the future on these Quiet Horror ones. But if you're watching live, let me know that you can still see us and hear us. New computer lately, so I'm running a little bit. I'm a little bit nervous about getting all the kinks worked out. Michael DeBronzo says, "Love that story. Thank you, Scott." And And Kenneth says that was good. And a few comments before while you were reading, he says, I don't know how many times I have bought and gifted the Sea of Ash to my friends.
Oh,
So-
wow. Thank you. That's lovely.
And as an aside, they still do see us in here.
Yay.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a chapter, the first chapter in a book called The Night Country, a novel by Stuart Onan. And I stumbled upon this book in Iowa in a library years and years ago. And of course, reading the jacket, the inside jacket, I just thought, wow, this story is definitely written for people like me. So I'm going to read the first little bit of the jacket, not the whole thing, and then read the first chapter. So my point is, with this, and I have Stuart Onan's permission to read this, and my point is with this is that if you love autumn, Halloween, that sort of thing, this is the kind of book that you like, and quiet ghost stories, so on and so forth. So anyway, The Night Country by Stuart Onan. And here's the inside jacket. At midnight on Halloween in a cloistered New England suburb, a car carrying 5 teenagers leaves a winding road and slams into a tree, killing 3 of them. One escapes unharmed. Another suffers severe brain damage. A year later, summoned by the memories of those closest to them, the 3 who died come back on a last chilling mission among the living. A strange and unsettling ghost story in the tradition of Ray Bradbury and Shirley Jackson. The night country creeps through the leaf-strewn streets and quiet cul-de-sacs of a bedroom community. There's more on the jacket, but that's all I'll read for now. This book, Stuart Onan dedicates it to he says, for Ray Bradbury. So, which in the library that night told me something too. So here we go. Chapter 1, Something Wicked. And this is only so that you guys will, the audience will think, wow, this sounds like a great book, and go out and purchase a copy for yourself. So, and it's because it's reminds me a lot of your writing, Scott. So yeah. All right. Something wicked. Come, do you hear it? The wind murmuring in the eaves, scouring the bare trees. How it howls, almost musical, a harmony of old moans. The house seems to breathe, an invalid. Leave your scary movie marathon. This is better than TV. Leave the lights out. The blue glow follows you down the hall. Go to the window in the unused room, the cold seeping through the glass. The moon is risen, caught in nodding branches. The image holds you, black trunks backlit, one silver ray fallen across the deck, beckoning. It's a romance, this invitation to lunacy, lycanthropy, a dance with the vampire, elemental yet forbidden, tempting, something remembered in the blood. Don't you ever wonder? Don't you want to know? Come then, come with us out into the night. Come now, America the lovesick, America the timid, the blessed, the educated. Come stalk the black back roads and stand outside the bright houses, calm as murderers in the yard, quiet as deer. Come, you slumberers, you lumps, arise from your legion of sleep and fly over the wild woods. Come, all you dreamers, all you zombies, all you monsters. What are you doing anyway, paying the bills, washing the dishes, waiting for the doorbell? Come on, take your keys, leave the bowl of candy on the porch. Put on the suffocating mask of someone else and breathe. Be someone you don't love so much for once. Listen, like the children, we only have one night. It'll be fun, trust me. We're not going to get caught. It's a game anyway, a masquerade. This is the suburbs. Nothing happens here. So come, friends, strangers, lovers, neighbors, come out of your den with the big screen TV. Come out of your warm house and into the cool night. Smell the wet leaves crushed to mush on the driveway. A stale mix of dust and coriander in the wind. It's the best time of year up here. The only season you want from us, our pastoral past. Witch hunts and wood smoke. The quaintly named dead in mossy churchyards. Never mind that it's all gone. The white picket fence is easy to clean vinyl. The friendship quilts stitched in the Dominican. This is still a New England. Garden green, veined with black rivers and massacres. Keep coming past the last square of sidewalk, past the new developments and their sparse lawns, past the strip malls with the Friendlies and the Chili's and the Gap, the CVS and the Starbucks and the Blockbuster, the KFC and the Chinese. Their signs dying comets in the night, traffic signals blinking. Come back through Stagecoach Lane and Blueberry Way and Old Mill Place, solving the labyrinth of raised branches where the last kids, too old but not wanting to grow up just yet, spill from minivans like commandos, charging across lawns for the front door, their bags rattling. The candy is serious here. Full-size Hershey bars and double Reese's cups. No, there's no time to stop, no need. That's in the past. The happy childhood we all should have had, did have, half missed, didn't appreciate. Keep your mask on. Say something now, it would give us all away. We're past that. The grinning pumpkins left behind, the stoops and warm windows, the reaching street lights. Out here, there's nothing but muddy creeks and marshland, stone fences guarding black pasture, gone wild. Here, you can still get lost if you want to. So come ride with us. Driving the night in circles, the trees startled in our headlights. What? You don't recognize the road? The blind curves and crumbled cut banks twisting so that we lean into each other. Intimate, even cozy, laughing as we crush the one on the end against the locked door. Remember the incense of cigarettes, the little attendant rituals. Make your fingers a scissors and bum one. It's okay, just don't pocket my lighter. The music's too loud to talk, and there's no reason. We're happy, trapped in ourselves and the night, this illusion of endlessness. High school, the freedom of wills. Be 17 again and ready for the world to love you. Feel the speed through the floor, the air lipping the windows. We're cutting corners, bowing the yellow line, floating over bumps. A deer, and that would be the end of us, yet the driver only goes faster. The woods dark as space, still wilderness. Look around now. Do you remember any of us? Your face has changed. Ours are the same. Frozen in yearbook photos in the local papers, nudged up against the school board news, the football scores, the library book sale. 1 week were history, martyred gods, then forgotten. Our names, you can't even make a guess. It's those kids who died, but you remember what happened, so you know where we're going. Have you seen it? Not just driven by, but have you stopped and gotten out and looked at the tattered bows and ribbons, the sagging mylar balloons, and greening pictures sealed in freezer bags, the plastic crosses and browning flowers, the notes written in girlish script, illegible now, pledging to remember us forever? Have you searched the trunk for scars, amazed at nature, since there's not a mark on it? Of course not. Even if you were from around here, you'd be used to it, maybe even annoyed at the cards and flowers, the shameless sentimentality of teenagers. Don't worry, they'll graduate and move away. Then our younger brothers and sisters off to college and jobs and marriage, leaving our parents, a mother who dedicates herself to a larger cause, a father who turns inward and strange. One wraps herself in bitterness, another discovers religion. Do they change into gaudy polyester snowbirds or let the house fall down around them? Whatever. Everyone forgets. You have to, isn't that true? Isn't that proof that time is merciful and not the opposite? Don't answer. You'll have time to think about it later. An entire night, an eternity. Halloween comes once a year. Can you breathe inside that thing? It's not too hot, is it? But look, we're almost there where the curve bears down on the crossroads. There's no other car, no bad luck, just the tree. The slick of wet leaves on the road, the romance of speed. It's the time of year that kills us. A lack of friction combined with a sideways vector, loose and centrifugal. The police will reconstruct it, pacing off the distances with a limp measuring tape. There's my lighter by the red X. Taking statements from the people on scene, photocopying the long reports for the courts and insurance companies. Someone you love has read it or not read it. The content's life-changing and unimportant. Checks deposited, money spent. From the back seat, you can't see the tree, or only at the last minute if you happen to be backseat driving. Chicken shit. Slow down. There's a second in which we realize we're not going to make the curve, all of us, even the most hopeful. The sound of the road, so constant, disappears, vacuumed into black silence. Light comes back from the trunk, as if the tree has flashed its brights, warning us off at the last second. It is a game of chicken. Oh shit, Danielle says. You feel it because she's in your lap, your arms wrapped around her ribs, her perfumed thinness. Toe, you fuck. Kyle right beside you. Who? Toe, Kyle, Danielle. See, you've already forgotten. What's my name? What's yours? It's a trick, not a treat. But the tree seems to leap out, seems to drive right at us, wide as a semi. Scream if you want to. After the first few times, you'll realize it's useless. You'll remember us and remember to say goodbye. You'll grow as sentimental as our friends and make this night and this drive stand for our lives. The five of us inseparable. So keep your eyes open. Don't cover your face as we leave the road and shoot through the high weeds, sifted by the grill-like wheat meeting a thresher. Remember what happens, how it sounds and smells and tastes. Enjoy the ride. Didn't I tell you? There's a reason we call on you, why this night comes again and again. Bad dream within a dream. You think it's torture, but you know it's justice. You know the reason. You're the lucky one, remember? You live. So again, that's the first chapter of The Night Country by Stuart Onan.
Damn.
That was remarkable. So much is packed into that passage.
Yeah.
I love the line, the illusion of endlessness. You know, like they're kind of immortalized, and yet they're ephemeral. They're gone, and the new people come, and they'll be forgotten and not immortalized. Even though the time described in that passage seems timeless. You know, within that timeless kind of a mood, lives come and go, but that the mood remains universal. That autumn mood.
Yeah.
It is seriously skilled, exceptional writing. Holy moly.
I agree.
And great reading on your part.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Mhm.
I hope so. It's a book I really love.
It is poetic. I can see how it evokes Bradbury and also Scott's work.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I've got a shelf over here and more on my Kindle of Halloween / autumn type books. And this is on that shelf, usually.
Mhm.
And, you know, we call these little sessions that we do once a month or once every 2 months, quiet horror. And I would say that The Night Country really embodies that phrase. You know, it's my opinion. Maybe Stuart would disagree, but it seems to be. It's a quiet ghost story of a sort, and it's a story about the people who are left behind too, and how it affects them. So
Makes me want to read it.
yes, pick it up. So yeah.
That's wonderful.
So Jeff, what are you going to read tonight?
Well, you were talking earlier how kind of like Scott's work tends to be like set in like ghost stories, you know, set in like the New England of the past and the England of the past. And I tend to write a lot of science fiction blended with horror. However, the story I picked tonight, in keeping with the theme of quiet horror, is kind of something that might have a flavor more like something that Scott would write. I even kind of started it out the way he does, setting the year and everything. So this is a story that originally appeared on my Patreon site, my sadly neglected Patreon site. And I put a little book together, a self-published book that is a collection of some of the stories that that first appeared on my Patreon page. So it's called Patrons of the Dark Arts. And so this is the only place it's appeared in print, other than, like I said, for my Patreon supporters.
That's
So
that's a neat thing to do for your patrons, though. That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
So it's a good-looking book.
It is, yeah. I was able to get some nice artwork for it and so forth.
Cool.
So it's got a bunch of the little. These are very, very short pieces, like almost like vignettes.
Yeah.
A collection of vignettes. So it ends with a longer story, which didn't appear on my Patreon site. It's kind of like a bonus for the people who actually want to get the book.
Well, you know, I may mention Halloween and autumn a lot just because that's the way I'm built. And so I say that about Scott, said that about Stuart Onan's book. But, I started off reading you and then discovered your brother. And I love your sci-fi horror as well. So, I'm glad you're reading a quiet horror tonight, but don't feel obligated.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Well, sometimes I feel like, wow, I don't know how many more quiet horror kind of stories I can find amongst my work that I would
find one that when you close, people will go, "Oh my God, we're sleeping with the lights on." Next time.
I think this one's in keeping with the kind of tone, though.
All right.
Like I said, I may have to kind of push it a little bit in the future as I run out of kind of quiet horror stories. And
well, I just didn't want you to feel obligated.
Noisy.
So, what's the name of this story?
This one's called Cracked Lips.
Okay. All right.
So it's Cracked Lips, and it takes place in New York City, 1850.
All right.
So here we go. After having sought contact from the inventor Joseph Faber for several months to no avail, word finally came back to Schenkel that Faber was dead by his own hand. The news affected Schenkel deeply on 2 counts. For one, He had wanted Faber to make some repairs to the Euphonia machine he had designed specifically for Schenkel at the latter's great expense. And the other aspect of this news that distressed Schenkel was that his dear wife, Eva, who had also died by her own hand 3 years earlier, was that his dear wife, Eva, had also died by her own hand 3 years earlier. It was Eva's suicide, of course, that had been behind Schenkel having approached Faber in the first place. Still absorbing the news, Schenkel wandered into his parlor, which, as he had received a few visitors since Eva's death, was given over entirely to the Euphonia. It was P.T. Barnum who had dubbed Faber's talking machine with that name, when the crafty showman had begun exhibiting it to the public that had ultimately proved ignorant and unimpressed. Schenkel, though, had been only too impressed with the work of his fellow German. Having heard of the machine, and since Faber was also settled in New York City, Schenkel had brought the inventor to his home to create a euphonium machine of his very own. It was, in critical ways, unlike the one shown by Barnum. This one had been meant to perform for Schenkel alone. All other furnishings had been removed from the parlor. Schenkel had even had his servants remove the paintings from the walls and the large mirror that had been mounted above the mantelpiece. This hadn't been based on Faber's recommendations, but was his own inspiration. Schenkel wanted nothing in this room to distract his focus from the machine that stood in the center of the bare wooden floor. Poor bedeviled man, Schenkel said aloud in German, as he stood now in front of the Euphonia, in front of the machine's human face. He finally gave in to his despair. The common fools could not appreciate his brilliance. If only he could have maintained hope and carried on longer, not allow himself to slip beneath the dark waters. He stared at the artificial countenance set into the machine, not on the far side, as in Faber's Euphonia, but situated directly above the keyboard, so that Schenkel could look into its painted glass eyes when he sat at those keys. His voice hitched as he continued. If only you could have stopped yourself from slipping beneath those black waters yourself, my love. If only I could have stopped you. He sat down on the cushioned bench in front of the machine's 17 piano-like keys. One of these labeled keys operated a mechanism analogous with the human glottis, while the other 16 produced all the principal sounds that were required to approximate human speech. A foot pedal pumped large black bellows behind the mounted mask, so that the vocal sounds, in something like breath gusting gently in Schenkel's face whenever the Euphonia spoke to him, issued from its movable lips of India rubber. Oh, the hours that Faber had worked in this room perfecting this machine, fine-tuning the complex collection of reeds and whistles, of levers and cords that stood in for muscles and tendons, the movement of the jaw and tongue within the molded rubber mask, fine-tuning all those intricate mechanisms until Faber had replicated, in as much as possible, and to Schenkel's obsessive specifications, the sound of his precious Eva's voice. Just as Faber had worked diligently in collaboration with several artists to create a visage that resembled with uncanny accuracy the features of Schenkel's beautiful young bride, framed in a curly blonde wig of real human hair. In the beginning, when he was alone with the Euphonia, with Eva, Schenkel would sit at the keyboard and speak to the mask, ask it questions such as, "You did love me, didn't you, my darling?" Then, at first with agonizing slowness, until, as the months passed, his fingers grew more swift and adept, and the machine's utterances came less haltingly, he would type Eva's own answers for her. In its soft and unearthly monotone, the mask would move its lips and reply, "Of course I loved you, my dear husband, with all my heart." "And you did no happiness with me?" "Oh yes, Daniel, you know I did." Schenkel would give a loud sob then, and with tears blurring the face hovering before him, making it all seem all the more pliable and lifelike, he would weep. "So then was it my doubt that caused you to do what you did, my love? Was it my accusations, my cruel distrust?" "No, no, my love, you mustn't blame yourself," Eva would reassure him. "I suffered these dark moods all my life. I hinted as much to you. It was my nature, darling Daniel, only my own nature." But how many times had he begged this reassurance from her, finding only fleeting comfort in the words that he himself put in her mouth, before he needed to ask himself the same questions again. After 2 years, these words of reassurance, even coming from Eva's face and Eva's voice, brought him less and less solace, until he had come upon another way in which to use the Euphonia, purely by chance. He doubted that Faber, a man of science, would have believed him or even approve. No, it wasn't to show Faber his new technique that Schenkel had wanted to bring the man back to his home. His reason was that over time, with the mask's oft-repeated movements, and drying out, as rubber will do, Eva's face had begun to crack around the jaw and lips, its paint to blister and flake. Schenkel had hoped that Faber would replace or somehow repair the mask. Now, with the man dead, Schenkel was left only with the possibility of tracking down the artists with whom Faber had collaborated when fashioning the mask originally. Schenkel had not intended to relate to Faber the story of how, late one night, after the servants had retired, and having imbibed too many glasses of whiskey, he had found himself seated in front of the Euphonium, crying out aloud, "If you loved me as you say, how could you do this thing to me? How could you leave me this way, Eva?" Then he had thrown his head down low over the keys, and with eyes squeezed tightly shut, in a fit of anguish, had played the keys blindly and wildly like a piano virtuoso in a fever of inspiration. As a result, Eva's words had come. "If you loved me as much as you claim, Daniel, how could you accuse me of taking other men to my bed when you were away, your friends, and even our servants?" Schenkel had snapped upright then, his eyes gone wide, and in jerking away from the keyboard, away from Eva's unblinking white face, had toppled backward off the piano bench and crashed onto his back on the floor. His servants had come running at the sound, alarmed. They said they had heard him quarreling with someone, and they thought an intruder had attacked him. By then he was back on his feet, however, and he sent them away brusquely. When he was once again alone, he turned to face Eva again. Silently staring Eva, still beautiful even with the webs of cracks around her jaw and the fissures splitting her plump lips. "I'm sorry, my darling," he whispered to her. "Forgive me, Eva. Please, can you forgive me?" Tentatively, he reseated himself, gingerly placed his fingers on the keys once more. But the shock had partly sobered him, and his eyes were open and his intentions too deliberate. Even when he tried depressing the keys at random, without any conscious intent, he produced only disturbing gibberish in place of coherent words. Finally, these sounds unsettled him so greatly that he had to stop. But over the weeks and months that followed, he had tried further experimentation and had been met with occasional success. The formula seemed to be some mysterious combination of tears and whiskey, whereby he entered into a state of mind frantic and tormented enough to summon forth Eva's spirit, enabling it to speak through the Euphonia, if only very briefly. Oh, of course he questioned what was taking place. Hadn't he in the past visited spiritualists in an attempt to contact Eva by means of seance, only to be tricked by charlatans and their darkness-concealed assistants? He had even consulted a Chinese spiritualist who had employed a technique called Fuji, whereby a planchet traced symbols in the spread ashes of burnt incense. Supposedly, Eva had delivered a few enigmatic words to Schenkel in that manner, but he had distrusted the spiritualist, had suspected that the man was either seeking to delude him or actually believed in the spirit writing, but was only deluding himself. So once again, couldn't it be that it was merely Schenkel's own mind that was ascribing these utterances to Eva, yet this time unconsciously? Deep down, though, he felt that wasn't the case. Because where once Eva would have only reassured him, now when the mask's lips moved, the words coming through them, were quite different in tone, accusing in tone, as he had once accused her. "Oh, if you had only believed in me, Daniel, everything would have been so different. But I couldn't stand your horrid words any longer, all your doubt in my character, all your doubt in my love." There were times when, after such sessions, Schenkel swore to never sit at the Euphonia again. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it, but he would cover it with a great cloth and lock the parlor up. Only days later, however, he would be unlocking that door again, drawing away that white shroud. He would lean in as if to apologize for his absence and kiss Eva's cracked lips. Where once he would only kiss them lightly, he would now kiss them lingeringly, would push his tongue into her mouth and play it across her own wooden tongue. And then he would start pouring the whiskey and pouring the tears. Now, still brooding on Faber's suicide and finding himself empathizing with the poor man's misery to an uncomfortable extent, Schenkel said to Eva, I can understand why he can no longer bear to live, with people accusing him of trickery, mocking him, and failing to realize how important his work might become. I can understand your frustrations too, my dear. Oh yes, you must believe me. You both suffered unfairly. Life is unending pain, is it not? I don't even know why I continue when I have lost the only thing that was truly important to me. In this light, can't you understand my doubts and insecurities? It was only because I loved you so very, very much. Only because my greatest fear was losing you. And in fearing such, I fulfilled those very fears. Schenkel didn't touch the keys to seek an answer to his questions or a response to his statements. He wasn't ready yet. He rose from the bench and turned to the coal fireplace behind him. From its mantelpiece, he took down the only other feature remaining in the parlor, a bottle of whiskey and a glass, tipping the former into the latter. He drank down a generous portion in one gulp before turning back to the euphonia. If I had the courage, I would join you. But do I deserve it? Have I earned my place beside you again? What must I do to atone, my love? He drank down more whiskey, asked more questions without sitting down at the keyboard for his answers. He walked the bare floor around the euphonia as if in its orbit, around and around, as if he couldn't find his way out of the room. Finally, though, when there was enough drink in him and his eyes had filled up, he set the glass aside and seated himself on the bench. He spread his trembling fingers above the keys, not yet touching them. What is it like where you are, darling? Tell me. Then, with eyes crunched shut, he crashed his fingers down on the keys, fingers flickering madly side to side. The flat, distant voice through the cracked rubber lips sighed, "It is cold and empty where I am." "Oh, my Eva," Schenkel blurted, juddering with sobs. "It is just as cold and empty here, because I am without you. It is hell here, hell. But is there a hell? Is there a heaven? I need to know where to find you when the time comes that I am worthy. Tell me, Eva, tell me, where are you now?" "I am standing behind you." Schenkel whirled around on the cushioned bench and met Eva's fixed eyes, dark in her pallid face. His first thought was that the mask set into the euphonia was reflected in the mirror over the mantelpiece. But then he remembered that he had had the servants remove the mirror from the wall. Those servants would later relate that they had found their master dead, still seated at the euphonia, his forehead resting on the keys, his grieving heart having apparently given out. Perhaps it was his head having dropped to the keys of that strange machine of his, expending the last of the air in its bellows, that had caused the strange sound that had brought the servants running to investigate. Even though they had heard many a strange sound come from the closed parlor before, this one had been exceptionally uncanny. It had sounded, they swore, like a woman's loud, long wail of sorrow.
That's fantastic and heartbreaking.
Thank you.
Yeah, before we talk about it a little bit more, the name of the story again and where it appears?
It's called Cracked Lips, and it's in this little collection called Patrons of the Dark Arts.
If someone wants to buy that particular book, do they need to find you on Patreon, or can they buy it on?
They can find this on Amazon.
Okay, Patrons of the Dark Arts by Jeffrey Thomas.
Yeah, these stories originally appeared on Patreon, my Patreon site, except for the last
They got
one.
to read them first.
Yes. Even though I don't keep up with it very well, I have premiered a lot of work first on my Patreon site that could fill books, actually. Even so, like I said, even though I neglect it terribly, and for my patrons, I put a lot of my my books there for free, books that I have published myself.
Well, you say you neglect it, but it sounds like you're giving them a lot of value.
Well, I'm not consistent about it. I'll dump a lot of stuff there, and then I'll kind of ignore it for a while. And
yeah, I love the story. One sentence particularly caught me, or part of a sentence. Pouring the whiskey and pouring the tears. That's great.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah. You're still muted, Scott. There we go. I just asked you to unmute.
Oh, hello.
There you are. There you are, sir.
That was excellent. Your writing is always flawless, and
Thank you.
it was just such a cool, angst-filled story and spooky too.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, this is something a little different from me. Like I said, that kind of has the tone of something that you would do. You know, it's kind of
Yeah,
that's
in
true.
your ballpark.
excellent.
Thank you.
Mark Jones says, I just bought it on Amazon. Thanks. And you got some other nice comments in there, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, as I said in the show notes below the YouTube video, you'll find links to Jeff and Scott on Amazon. Now, Jeff's pretty easy. I think I put it to his Amazon page. Can't remember what I did with Scott. I might have pointed at the Sea of Ash. I don't know. Problem with Scott is there's another Scott Thomas who writes very differently from our Scott Thomas. So, you know, if you see a book called Midnight in New England or The Sea of Ash, that kind of thing, it's our Scott Thomas. I forget the titles of the other guys' work.
If you see Violet or Kill Creek,
yes,
it's not me.
Kill Creek. That's the one I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention is, sorry, what, Jeff?
I'll get people to say to me, "Hey, I loved your brother's book, Kill Creek." I said, "Oh no, no, don't get it started."
Just say thank you. He's in jail right now, but he wrote it from prison. Have you guys now? We're attempting to do this once a month. Sometimes it's a little bit longer than that. That's fine, no big deal. On Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. On most of the Tuesday nights where we're not doing quiet horror stories, I've been doing, as you both know, old time radio horror. I'll do 2 episodes, so it's usually an hour long. It's not this format. Nobody sees anyone's face. It's basically what they call a YouTube premiere. So I pick a couple of old time radio shows and I upload them and you know, try to make it look a little spiffy with some artwork and the title and everything.
Yes.
And yeah, and you know, the thing is, all of these are out there on the internet. You know, anybody can just, you know, if you want, can find them and listen to them. But I've been listening to old time radio since I was 8, 9 years old. So, you know, hopefully I can point you in the right directions of some of the better ones, which is of course subjective. I played one of our favorites the other couple of weeks ago, Scott and Jeff, House in Cypress Canyon.
The best radio play I've ever heard.
I love that you're doing this, and great choices. Great choices too.
And like you said, even though Mike, that this work is readily available, people might not think of it unless somebody who's fond of it points you to it, you know, and kind of encourages you to give it a try and lets you know which are some of the better ones. So people might never ever think to seek it out unless somebody like you makes them aware of it.
The other thing too about this is, and I speak just for the live listeners, of course, again, many more people listen to it later. Not everybody can make Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. You know, they have to watch it later on in the week or a month later or a year later, whatever. But for those who are watching live, you know, we really are in a golden age of television and movies. What with you know, Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and just all these choices, but we've lost something that we're not watching these things at the same time anymore per se. And so the nice thing about when I do this on Tuesday nights is, for the live viewers, is we're listening to the exact same thing at exactly the same time. So last week, one of them was The Price of Fear, brought to you by Vincent Price. And I forget what the first one was, but I don't believe I'm going to have one this coming Tuesday, but after that I will have one, and it's going to stay pretty regular. I think I've done 3 already, and I started like 5 weeks ago. It's just a lot of fun, and I don't have to talk, so bonus, you know.
It's like you said too, that when these radio plays initially aired, that was how it was done. You know, the family
everyone sat
gathered
they gathered around from the radio and listened.
And it was
I
that one
love that
shot.
communal aspect.
Yeah, well, it used to be like an event, like the family would sit down and watch
Yeah.
Wizard of Oz, and if you missed it, you have to wait next year for it,
Yeah,
and that was the case for any holiday special or any movie that you might like, and
right.
and so it was a big deal.
Phil
Mhm.
Jones just reminded me on the live chat, the first one that I played was Nightfall, I think. So
Oh,
and I'm getting my weeks mixed up, but that Hall of Fantasy one where it starts off where the guy is sitting in his dead friend's house reading
yes.
from his journal, and there's a storm outside, and he's like, there is something in the house watching me. Have you guys heard that one before? You probably have.
Sure,
But
perhaps.
yeah, it's called He Who Follows Me, the Hall of Fantasy. And you just go to the Lovecraft Easy, just go to YouTube, type in Lovecraft Easy, and I've got like the podcast row, and then several other rows, quiet horror, old time radio, that sort of thing. So
Sadly, I have a lot of radio plays, old classic radio plays and spooky plays that I used to play every Halloween. I'd try to go through them all, but they're all on audio cassette, and I
Oh.
don't have an audio cassette player anymore. I got to
Oh, wow.
well, let me introduce you to Google. You and
Grab one.
Google become friends,
Yes.
or
Well,
archive.org.
I've sought out a lot of them that I have. I have sought out them, like Donovan's Brain with Orson Welles,
Yeah,
and the Hellbound Heart read by Clive Barker, and things like
I
that.
don't know. I'm not disparaging you, because to me it's kind of like having a vinyl record these days. If you got old time radio on audio cassette, it's still pretty cool, even if it's not as practical.
It
So-
is
Yeah.
practical, but
Yeah.
So a couple of things I want to finish. I want to say before we finish up. If you like quiet horror, I'm going to surprise you with a recommendation by Sting, the singer of all people,
Huh.
and he wrote and sang a song called "Ghost Story."
Oh,
So you can probably find it on YouTube, or hopefully to support the artist on Spotify. But either way, it's Sting and it's Ghost Story, and if you listen to the lyrics, it really is a ghost story, and it really is. It's very heartbreaking, and it's about a guy who's a ghost who's trying to figure out, did I really love you? And I don't want to spoil it, but the lyrics are very important, and the music is great.
oh,
Wow.
I'll have to seek that out. I thought you were going to say
Yeah.
his song "Moon Over Bourbon Street," which is inspired by Anne Rice's Lestat. So I thought that's where you were going with it, but
Yeah,
I never heard of that one, so I'm going to have to check that out.
Yeah.
And I got to ask you, Scott, is the wrought iron skeleton, is he a ancestor of Fractured Harry by any chance?
They might be related. Who knows?
All right, I'm going to read one more thing if you guys got 5 minutes,
Sure.
because this is decidedly not quiet horror. I remember I saw on YouTube, this was like, I don't know, 6 months or a year back, Stephen King was giving a little talk with, I don't know, there were maybe like, I don't know, 50 people in the audience. It was hard to tell. Paul was there too. He plugged Paul's new book at the time. And then he starts giving this little spiel about thanking people for coming out that night, and be careful when you drive home. I'm not going to do Stephen King's words justice. Should have written it down, because I thought about it too late. He's like, and I hope that you remembered to lock the door when you left. And, I hope that, if you did lock the door, that you remember to check behind the shower curtain. He's just going through this list, and people, and he's just so good at it, So, all right, this is an absolutely true story. I checked it out. This is a short newspaper article from the 1860s. I better get a quick drink real quick. All right. It's titled "The End of a Mystery." Now, don't anyone email me and say this is not quiet horror, because I know it's not. The End of a Mystery. Starved to death in a mine is the subheading. A dispatch from Wheeling, West Virginia, USA states that a remarkable discovery was made there in the latter part of last week regarding the fate of 4 men who mysteriously disappeared 32 years ago. The men were John Ewing of Liverpool, James Olney of Manchester, and 2 Americans named Benjamin Aries and Thomas Ackelson. While the recesses of an abandoned coal mine were being explored a day or two ago, 4 human skeletons were found. One was sitting in an almost upright position against the rock, while on the ground beside it was a bottle containing a note scribbled on a piece of paper and consisting of the following passages. Quote, November 22nd, I think that says, 1863. Should this ever reach the world, let it be known that we are prisoners here owing to the caving in of the mine. Our food and water are gone. This is about the 8th day of our imprisonment. November 4th. Ewing and Ackelson have just killed Aries and are eating him. I have already eaten a bootleg. The oil in our lamp is getting scarce and the air is foul. November 6th. Ewing has just killed Ackelson and has cut off his feet and is eating them. He is dancing around with a drawn knife like a maniac. When I tweeted this, at this point, Laird Barron replied, like a maniac?
What's it take to be a real maniac?
Yeah, sorry, Laird, he didn't have an editor. I laughed my ass off when he tweeted that. All right, November 7th. I am alone with the dead. I had to kill Ewing in self-defense. I have just finished eating the other bootleg. I am going to enclose this note in a flask to preserve it, if possible, so that my fate may be known. Joseph Olney. The men's disappearance is well remembered by old residents of Wheeling and was finally given up as an insoluble mystery. The then British consul, made inquiries, but was unable to learn. They say nothing, but I guess it should be anything. That's it.
Wow.
Whoa.
And that is a true story?
That's a true story. Yeah.
Oh my God,
Gee.
that's ghastly. That is ghastly.
Man.
Yeah, I actually linked to one of the articles when I tweeted about it, I think yesterday. So
Mhm.
Man, oh man.
yeah. Okay, so my question is this. Is this what really happened? Or did the last guy just make up the I'm a good guy scenario?
Oh.
Mhm.
Who
We'll never
knows?
know.
Who
I tend to
knows?
think that's what really happened, but who knows?
Oh my gosh.
Sheesh.
That's pretty much my vision of hell, being trapped
Yeah.
in a mine with no possibility of rescue.
Oh my God.
And then the other guys start killing and eating each other.
Ugh.
So, yeah,
Horrific.
I hate when that happens.
me too.
Mhm.
Well, anyway, Phil Jones says you can buy a cassette to MP3 converter that looks like a Walkman. So
Yeah, I'm sure that I should really look into ways to convert those or transfer them. I'm so afraid now that they're so precious to me that I have a lot of audio letters that W.H. Pugmire used to send to me, and they're all on cassette, and I dread playing one and having it tangle or get ruined or something. But I want to get those onto.
my
CD.
advice is if you can find someone for a reasonable price who does this sort of thing for a living, to
Mm.
have them do that
Yeah,
and convert them to MP3.
sure.
Because yeah, we all love Willem, and I know you knew him a lot longer than I did, and you don't want to lose those. I mean, at some point, no matter what you do, those cassettes are going to deteriorate. So you
Yeah,
want to put them
Mm.
on MP3 if you can.
true. I
Mhm.
gotta
I have one too.
Yeah. Gmail, man, I have so many. I just have to type in his email address in Gmail, and I've got so many emails from him.
Yeah.
So
Yep. Mhm.
anyway, everyone, thank you for listening and watching. Thanks to Stuart Ronan for letting me read the first chapter of his book. Thanks to you guys, great readings,
Thank you.
Thank you.
and
Having us.
pick up these guys' books. So have a good night, and we will see everybody this Sunday, of course, for the regular show. And as far as this sort of thing goes, Quiet Horror, sometime next month, we'll figure it out. But in 2 weeks, Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, we will do another Old Time Radio
Cool.
dual show. So, all right.
Cool.
Thanks everybody for watching, and good night.
Night, everybody.